The world of medieval history was never as quiet as the faded drawings in old books might make us believe. Behind the stone walls of castles, in the twisting alleys of market towns, and across the muddy fields where peasants worked from dawn until dusk, there were stories of people who were feared, hunted, and whispered about for generations. These were the most wanted people of the medieval world. Some were kings who lost their crowns. Others were knights who betrayed their oaths, while many were ordinary men and women who rose up against power and became legends. Their names echoed across kingdoms, carried by rumors, written in secret letters, and shouted in royal courts. And those centuries have passed, their stories still leave behind questions, mysteries, and a strange fascination that keeps us awake at night, even when we are meant to be falling asleep. Imagine the scene. A small village at the edge of Europe. The year is 1347, and a rumor spreads like fire. The villagers whisper that a notorious outlaw has been spotted in the nearby woods. Mothers pull their children indoors. Merchants lock away their goods, and a quiet fear creeps across the land. No one knows if the story is true, but in those days, the idea of a wanted figure wandering close by was enough to shake an entire community. The medieval world lived on edge, where law and order were fragile, and danger lurked in both the shadows of forests and the hearts of men who desired more than what life had given them. We often think of medieval history as kings in shining armor and queens in tall towers, but the truth is far more human. Behind the grandeur of royal courts, there were people who refused to obey, who challenged authority, who broke rules not just out of greed or ambition, but sometimes out of desperation or a sense of justice twisted by the harsh realities of their time. These wanted men and women were not simply criminals. They were symbols of fear, rebellion, and resistance. They were pursued with the same intensity as modern fugitives, sometimes for years, and their stories shaped the way kingdoms ruled and how ordinary people understood power. One of the most striking parts of the medieval world was how news of these wanted figures traveled. There was no printing press for much of the era, no newspapers or telegraphs, and yet word spread faster than one might expect. A tale of an outlaw might begin with a frightened peasant, pass to a traveling merchant, then whispered into the ears of guards, and before long the whole countryside was watching the roads. A king might declare a man an enemy of the crown, and suddenly his name became etched into the memory of every villager who had never even seen his face. Being most wanted in medieval history meant becoming both a real danger and a legend, woven into the imagination of everyone who heard the story. But what made someone so dangerous, so feared, that their names were carried from kingdom to kingdom? Some were warriors who turned their swords against their lords. Some were heretics who challenged the teachings of the church and inspired crowds to follow them. Some were rebels who refused to bow to kings and instead tried to carve out their own rule. And some, in quieter ways, were poets, thinkers, or wanderers whose words or actions unsettled those in power. These figures became hunted not only for their deeds, but also for what they represented: defiance, challenge, and a refusal to accept the world as it was. If you listen closely to the past, you can almost hear their footsteps on the cobblestones, their cloaks brushing against the damp walls of alleys, their whispers traded in candlelit taverns. They were never safe, always glancing over their shoulders, always ready to vanish into the night. And yet, despite the risks, many of them grew bolder, drawing more followers, stirring more chaos, and forcing rulers to respond with harshness that often only made the legend stronger. To understand the most wanted people of medieval history, we must also understand the times they lived in. These were centuries shaped by famine, plague, war, and constant struggle. Life was not secure for ordinary people, and even kings found their thrones shaking beneath them. The law was not written in stone, but carried out by men whose loyalty could be bought or broken. In such a fragile world, anyone who stood out, who dared to resist, or who lived outside the order of church and crown, quickly became a target. It was not always about justice. It was about control, fear, and survival. Yet there is something strangely human in the stories of these fugitives. They were not faceless shadows. They had families, hopes, flaws, and dreams. Some fought because they believed they had no other choice. Others simply craved more power than they were given. Some were cruel, yes, but others were admired secretly by those who wished they too could stand against the heavy weight of rulers and priests. When we hear their names now, centuries later, we're not just learning history. We're touching the edge of their lives, their choices, and the uncertain world they left behind. Picture a knight, once sworn to protect his king, now riding under the cover of night with soldiers hunting him from every corner of the realm. Imagine a woman accused of heresy, fleeing from town to town, gathering followers even as the church declares her dangerous. Think of a rebel who raises a banner in defiance, his face known to every soldier in the kingdom, his name cursed by nobles but whispered with admiration by peasants. These are not distant figures. They lived and breathed, and for a moment in time, they carried the heavy weight of being most wanted. And tonight, as we settle into this story, we will walk beside them. We will follow their paths through forests and fields, through castles and prisons, through whispers and battles. We will listen to the fears of those who hunted them, and we will try to understand the hopes of those who hid them. The medieval world was harsh, but within that harshness, these figures shined like sparks, sometimes destructive, sometimes inspiring, always unforgettable. But before we step further, there is a question that lingers in the shadows of this story. Were these wanted figures truly villains, or were they victims of a world that crushed anyone who dared to live differently? Were they symbols of danger or symbols of freedom? History does not always answer clearly, and in that silence lies the suspense that keeps us listening. As the night deepens and the world grows quiet around us, we turn the page to meet the faces of those who lived as fugitives in an age of kings and swords. Their names will unfold, one by one. Their choices will haunt us, and their fates will remind us how fragile power and freedom have always been. But the most pressing question remains: who was the most dangerous, the most feared, the one whose shadow fell across an entire age? That is the mystery waiting on the edge of the story, and it begins now. The world of the Middle Ages was shaped by people who carried more weight than they may have ever imagined. Every marketplace had its gossip, every tavern its drunken stories, and every court its whispers about traitors and outlaws. To be placed on a king's wanted list was not only a threat to one's life, but a mark that followed like a shadow everywhere they went. In those days, the very idea of being wanted carried an air of doom. Posters nailed to tavern doors were rare, but word of mouth was far more powerful than parchment. People didn't need paper to know who was being hunted. They carried the names of the infamous on their tongues, repeating them again and again until even children playing in the streets knew who to fear. Imagine being one of these people. Every knock on the door at night might mean soldiers waiting outside. Every rustle of leaves in the woods could be the sound of a bounty hunter creeping closer. Even the sight of a stranger in a market could twist your stomach with dread. The medieval world was a dangerous place for the ordinary person, but for someone branded as a traitor or outlaw, it was a constant fight between survival and capture. Few slept easily, for the walls of castles were high, the forests deep, and yet there was always the sense that one day, no matter how far you ran, the hand of the crown or the church would finally close around you. One thing that made medieval fugitives so unique was how their stories blurred the line between truth and legend. Some became larger than life in their own lifetimes. A thief might have stolen from a noble once, and before long the tale had grown into a myth that he robbed dozens of lords and shared the spoils with peasants. A heretic might have questioned one priest, but in the retelling, she was said to have stood before crowds and defied bishops. These exaggerations did more than just entertain. They transformed the hunted into figures of mystery and fascination, making them even harder to catch. People who admired their defiance might hide them, protect them, or help them vanish into the landscape. It is worth remembering that medieval life was not fair or balanced. Laws were often designed to protect the powerful and punish the weak. Kings ruled with armies, and the church with the threat of eternal damnation. For many peasants, justice was not something they expected to find in courts or castles. So when someone stood up against authority, even if only by accident, it stirred something in the hearts of those who had no power. That is why some of the most wanted people in medieval history were not hated by everyone. They were feared by kings and priests, yes, but they were quietly respected or even loved by those who saw them as voices against tyranny. Take, for example, the image of a wandering knight stripped of his titles. Once loyal to his lord, now marked as a traitor. He moves from village to village, armor hidden beneath a heavy cloak, offering his sword to protect farmers from raiders or to fight in small skirmishes far from the eyes of the crown. To the court, he is a criminal. To the people, he is a hero in disguise. His name appears in official lists, but his story lives in the mouths of those who whisper it by firelight. Which version is closer to the truth? Perhaps neither. Perhaps both. That is the strange beauty of medieval tales. They refuse to stay still, shifting between fact and myth until they become something more powerful than either alone. The medieval world did not only create wanted outlaws from warriors and knights. It also saw the rise of thinkers and rebels who challenged the church. At a time when the church shaped nearly every part of daily life, questioning its teachings was dangerous. Yet some dared to do it, and in doing so, they drew attention from the most powerful force in the medieval world. To be declared a heretic was one of the worst fates. It meant your name would be written down in records, spoken about in sermons, and your very presence would be seen as poison to the faithful. People who challenged doctrine often ended up on the run, moving from town to town, their ideas spreading faster than the men sent to silence them. Imagine walking into a small medieval inn, the firelight flickering, travelers hunched over wooden cups of ale. In the corner sits a man who speaks softly of a new way to see the world, a new truth about faith and power. His words are careful, but dangerous. One listener nods in agreement. Another looks nervously toward the door, worried a priest might overhear. In a moment like that, one person's quiet defiance could spark a chase that lasted for years. For once a preacher, thinker, or writer was branded as dangerous, their fate was sealed. No sword was needed to mark them as wanted. Their words alone were enough. And then there were the rebels. Medieval Europe was full of uprisings, some small, some large enough to shake kingdoms. Whenever peasants rose against their lords, leaders emerged. Men and women who refused to bow, who raised banners of defiance, who promised a better world even if it meant risking everything. These leaders became the most wanted people of all, because they represented not just themselves, but entire movements. If captured, they were executed as examples. If they escaped, they became symbols of hope. Either way, their names lived on, carried across generations. What makes these medieval fugitives so captivating is not only the drama of their lives, but the question of how they endured. Did they feel fear every day, or did their defiance give them strength? Did they regret their choices when the noose or the sword finally caught up with them? Or did they die believing they had changed something in the world? History rarely gives us clear answers. We see their names in old records, scratched in a parchment by scribes who may have hated them or admired them in secret. We hear echoes of their lives in songs and poems that blur the line between fact and fantasy. And somewhere in between lies the truth. Tonight, as we wander deeper into these tales, we should keep in mind that the most wanted people in medieval history were not so different from us. They loved, they feared, they hoped, and they dreamed. Their choices might have been larger, their consequences heavier, but the human heart beating beneath the cloak of a fugitive was the same as any heart today. To be hunted is a universal fear. To stand against authority is a universal temptation. And to be remembered, even after death, is a universal desire. These people carried all of that, making their stories timeless. But who were they truly? What names were carried from one kingdom to the next, dreaded by kings and cherished by peasants? Which figures were so dangerous that they were pursued for years, their fates entwined with wars, uprisings, and the power struggles of an entire age? As the fire burns low and the night grows quieter, we will begin to bring those names forward one by one. And yet, as we do, there's an unsettling thought. Perhaps the most wanted people of medieval history were not just hunted by kings, but by the very world around them, a world that feared change more than it feared crime. The first of these stories waits just ahead, its details blurred by centuries, its edges sharp enough to still unsettle us. But who it was and why they were hunted is a secret we will uncover only as the night deepens. The medieval world did not lack for faces that stirred both fascination and fear. And to begin walking among these wanted souls, we might imagine ourselves stepping into the smoke-filled air of a medieval town square. The cobblestones are slick from rain, the sound of hooves echoing down the narrow streets. And at the center, a royal messenger unrolls a parchment. The people gather, peasants with rough hands and merchants with fur-lined cloaks, all leaning in to hear the words. A name is read aloud, a name that sends murmurs through the crowd. A bounty has been placed, a reward promised. Whoever brings this person in, dead or alive, will be rewarded by the king himself. That is how many of these stories began, not in grand halls, but in hushed announcements that spread like wildfire. Among the earliest figures to be hunted so relentlessly were the outlaws of the forests. In many regions, the forest was both a place of refuge and fear. To the ordinary peasant, the woods were filled with bandits, spirits, and wolves. To those who were pursued by law, the forest became a shield. There are countless tales of men who vanished into the trees, emerging only at night to raid caravans or strike at wealthy travelers. Sometimes they left the poor untouched, earning a reputation as protectors. Other times, their raids spread terror to everyone alike. Yet, one thing was certain. The forest kept secrets, and so long as the branches closed above their heads, fugitives could survive. These men became wanted not only because they stole, but because they showed that even kings could not fully tame the wild. It is tempting to think of someone like Robin Hood here, though his story may be more legend than truth. Yet, the idea behind him, a wanted man defying the rich and protecting the poor, shows us why such figures captured the medieval imagination. To rulers, these forest outlaws were dangerous criminals, threats to order, enemies of peace. But to the common folk, they were sparks of rebellion, proof that the powerful were not untouchable. Every outlaw pursued into the woods became part of this larger myth, whether they intended to or not. The crown could declare them most wanted, but the people could transform them into something much more enduring. Beyond the forests, the world of medieval heresy gave rise to its own most wanted figures. Imagine a preacher standing on a wooden box in a crowded town square. He speaks not of kings and nobles, but of fairness, of equality, of a faith that is different from the one demanded by priests in cathedrals. His voice carries, his words ignite something restless in the crowd. Men nod, women listen with wide eyes, and suddenly the messenger of the church sees the danger. The preacher's words travel faster than soldiers on horseback. Within days, neighboring towns repeat his ideas. Within weeks, priests are demanding his arrest. Before long, his name is spoken with both admiration and fear. To the church, he is a heretic, an enemy of truth. To many villagers, he is a voice of hope. And that is how one becomes most wanted, by standing in defiance, not just with weapons, but with words. The danger of ideas cannot be overstated. In a time when faith shaped every law, every custom, and every hope of salvation, anyone who challenged it was seen as shaking the very foundations of society. Some of the most hunted people in medieval Europe were thinkers whose writings or teachings threatened the delicate balance of power between church and crown. Their trials were not just about guilt or innocence, but about silencing voices that others might follow. Even today, The records of these trials read more like warnings than judgments, as if the scribes themselves feared the strength of the ideas being spoken. But not all fugitives were rebels or preachers. Some were rulers themselves, kings, princes, or nobles who lost power and suddenly found themselves hunted by the very people they once commanded. This reversal was a terrifying reality of the medieval world. One day a man might sit on a throne, giving orders with confidence. The next, he could be a fugitive, his name cursed, his allies gone, his enemies hunting him with a vengeance. History is filled with stories of dethroned rulers who disguised themselves, fleeing across borders, hiding in monasteries, or seeking refuge in foreign lands. To be most wanted at that level meant that the hunt was not just for a person, but for the idea of legitimacy itself. As long as a rival claimant to the throne lived, no king could sleep easily. Picture a dethroned prince, once surrounded by servants, now trudging alone through muddy fields with only a cloak for warmth. His face, once seen on coins, is now whispered about in every tavern. Soldiers patrol roads, searching for him, and yet he survives, moving by night, relying on the kindness of strangers who may not even know who he is. For such a man, being wanted was not simply about crime or rebellion. It was about survival in a world that turned against him. In the medieval age, power was never permanent, and those who lost it became the hunted just as easily as they had once been the hunters. And then there were the rebels who tried to unite people in open defiance. Time and again, peasant uprisings broke out across medieval Europe, often fueled by heavy taxes, famine, or war. The leaders of these uprisings rarely survived long, for the crown made sure to crush them swiftly and brutally. Yet while their bodies were broken, their names lived on. These men and women became symbols of resistance, remembered long after their banners had fallen. To the rulers, they were dangerous agitators who threatened peace. To the peasants, they were martyrs. Such figures became wanted not just in their own lifetimes, but in the memory of all who lived after. What makes all these stories remarkable is how human they are. Each fugitive carried hopes and fears just as we do. Each lived in a fragile balance between courage and terror. Imagine the sound of armored boots outside your hiding place. Imagine the silence of a church when your name is spoken as a warning. Imagine the forest paths where you move quickly, knowing one mistake could lead to capture. These experiences bound all wanted people together, no matter whether they were thieves, preachers, or kings. And so, as we prepare to dive deeper into the lives of these most wanted figures, we are left with a question: what drove them? Was it greed, faith, ambition, or was it something simpler, a refusal to accept the world as it was given to them? The answer is not always clear, and perhaps that is why these stories remain so powerful. They are not tales of perfect heroes or perfect villains, but of flawed human beings caught in struggles far larger than themselves. The first of their stories waits ahead, and it will take us into the heart of danger, rebellion, and survival. But who will it be? A knight turned outlaw? A preacher branded a heretic? A dethroned king fleeing for his life? The answer lingers in the shadows of history, waiting to be uncovered as our journey into the most wanted people of the medieval world continues. In the centuries of the medieval world, danger was never far away, and the line between loyalty and betrayal was thin. To understand why certain people became so feared, so relentlessly pursued, we need to picture the world they lived in. Life was hard, uncertain, and often cruel. Villages clung to survival against famine, plague, and war. Kings fought over land. Lords taxed the poor until they had nothing left, and the church held immense power over every soul. In such a setting, anyone who stepped outside the rules became a threat to the fragile order. And when someone challenged authority openly, their names spread across the land, carried by rumor until it reached the farthest corners of the kingdom. Every story of a wanted figure begins with a moment of defiance, and it is that first act, small or great, that set the chase in motion. A knight who refused his lord's order, a preacher who spoke too boldly, a peasant leader who told the hungry that they deserved more than scraps. These moments were sparks, and in the medieval world, sparks rarely faded quietly. They spread. They grew. They lit fires in the minds of people who were tired of bowing their heads. Those in power understood this danger, and so they moved quickly. A royal order would be issued, sometimes sealed in wax, sometimes shouted in a crowded square, and a person who might once have been unknown suddenly became infamous. But being declared wanted was not just a political label. It was a sentence that followed you everywhere. Imagine waking each morning unsure if you would live to see nightfall. Every face you met might be friend or betrayer. A kind stranger offering bread might, within hours, hand you over to the sheriff in exchange for coin. Families were torn apart as husbands or wives fled into the night, leaving behind children who grew up hearing only whispers about their parents. To live as wanted in the medieval world was to carry both the weight of survival and the heavy silence of isolation. The fear was not only for fugitives themselves, but for those who helped them. Harboring a rebel, feeding an outlaw, or listening to the words of a heretic could bring punishment just as severe as the fugitive faced. Whole communities sometimes suffered because one of their own had offered shelter. This made the act of helping someone even more powerful. When a villager chose to hide an outlaw in a barn, or when a priest chose to give bread to a hunted man, it was more than kindness. It was quiet rebellion, a refusal to let fear control every action. These small choices added to the mystery, for how could a wanted figure survive for months or years without aid? Behind every fugitive was a hidden network of sympathy, a web of secrecy that was often invisible to the authorities. What also made these people so dangerous in the eyes of kings and priests was the way their stories refused to die. Even when fugitives vanished, even when no one could find them, their legends grew. A knight who disappeared into the woods was said to have robbed a nobleman's caravan. A preacher who escaped a trial was rumored to be gathering followers in distant villages. A dethroned prince who vanished across the sea was believed to be plotting his return. The absence of truth became fertile ground for myth, and myths were harder to kill than men. This is why kings spent fortunes chasing rebels across lands, why soldiers rode for months searching forests, and why priests warned villages again and again. The fear was not only of what these fugitives had done, but of what people believed they might still do. Even today, reading about them carries a strange suspense. Their lives were full of narrow escapes and uncertain endings. Did the outlaw survive another winter in the forest, or was he betrayed by a friend? Did the heretic find safety among followers, or was she caught in the dead of night? Did the exiled prince build an army in foreign lands, or did he die unknown, his name only a whisper in songs? These unanswered questions give their stories a haunting quality, for we are left standing in the middle of history, looking both forward and back, unable to see the full picture. The medieval world also had a way of turning enemies into examples. Public punishment was not only about justice, it was about sending a message. Wanted figures knew this. Capture meant not only death, but humiliation. Trials were staged, confessions forced, and executions carried out in front of crowds. The threat of such an ending weighed heavily on those in hiding. To avoid capture was not simply to live longer, but to preserve dignity, to keep the story from ending in the way the powerful wished it to. For some fugitives, this meant constantly moving, never staying in one place long enough for betrayal to take root. For others, it meant disguises, false names, and living under the shadow of secrecy until even they no longer remembered who they had once been. But in the dark corners of medieval towns, in the fields where peasants labored, and in the taverns where stories flowed as freely as ale, the fugitives lived on. Their names were spoken not as criminals, but as symbols of courage, resistance, or defiance. A man who stood against a lord might be cursed in a courtroom, but praised in a village. A woman accused of heresy might be condemned by priests, but remembered as a prophet by those who listened. A prince in exile might be called a traitor by one king, but a rightful ruler by another. The meaning of most wanted depended on who was speaking, and in that divide lay the true mystery of their stories. Each of these figures carried with them more than fear. They carried questions. Were they rebels or heroes? Criminals or martyrs? Did they flee because they were guilty, or because they dared to live differently in a world that allowed little freedom? History gives us fragments, but fragments are enough to build suspense. For behind every wanted man or woman lies a deeper truth about the world they came from, a truth about power, survival, and the fragile nature of justice. And so, as we lean deeper into their stories, we step into a world of candlelit rooms where names are whispered in secrecy, of forest paths where shadows stretch long in the moonlight, of castles where kings grow restless because a fugitive still roams free. The tension grows, the mysteries deepen, and the question remains unresolved. Who among them carried the greatest weight? Who was the most wanted of them all? That answer still lies ahead, waiting, hidden in the silence of history. To truly understand why some figures became the most wanted people in medieval history, we must look at the way power was built and broken in that age. The medieval world was not one steady, peaceful picture. It was a restless place where kingdoms shifted, where famine could undo years of progress, and where war seemed almost constant. Every change in fortune left someone on top and someone beneath, and often those who fell became fugitives. This was the soil in which wanted men and women were born. The forests were thick with secrets, but so too were the towns. Narrow streets, dimly lit by torches, created a perfect stage for both rebellion and betrayal. In the marketplace, voices carried rumors faster than any royal messenger. A merchant selling cloth might lean closer to a buyer and whisper that the king's soldiers had been spotted in pursuit of a dangerous outlaw. A servant might carry scraps of gossip from the castle, stories of a noble who had fled in disgrace. A monk might pen a careful line in a manuscript, knowing that the person he described was now being hunted across the land. Even those who never laid eyes on the fugitives could not escape their presence, for their stories filled the air. To be most wanted was to become part of everyone's lives, whether people wished it or not. It was a kind of fame, dark and uncertain, that stretched across villages and fields. The common folk would sometimes cheer in secret when they heard of an outlaw evading capture, while nobles tightened their guards and looked nervously toward the horizon. The fugitives existed in a strange middle ground, despised and hunted by the powerful, yet sometimes admired by those who lived under their rule. This tension is what made them so difficult to erase. Behind every wanted figure, there was also a story of power lost or denied. A knight stripped of land and title was not only a man with nothing left to lose, but also a man who knew the weaknesses of the world he had once served. A preacher cast out by the church was not only a hunted soul, but a voice that refused to be silenced. A dethroned ruler was not only an exile, but a living reminder that power could crumble. These people carried with them more than just their own survival. They carried the weight of the systems they challenged. That is why kings, lords, and priests hunted them so fiercely. And yet, what made these figures so intriguing was not only their resistance, but their humanity. Imagine, for a moment, the outlaw in a damp cave, listening to the wind howl outside as he tries to sleep, his sword at his side. Imagine the preacher by candlelight, writing down words that she knows could cost her life, yet refusing to stop. Imagine the prince in exile, standing at the edge of a foreign shore, staring across the sea toward the homeland that now sees him as an enemy. These are not faceless shadows. They're human beings who lived with fear and longing, who wanted safety, recognition, or change, and who were willing to risk everything to reach it. The medieval age was a time when the balance between control and chaos was fragile. One rebellion could spark another. One heretical sermon could unsettle a whole town. One outlaw's daring escape could inspire dozens of songs. This constant threat of unrest is what made rulers so determined to crush fugitives swiftly. But sometimes, the harder they tried to silence someone, the louder the story became. Every proclamation of guilt made people more curious. Every public execution turned the condemned into a figure remembered long after their death. Ironically, the pursuit of these wanted figures often gave them more life in memory than they might otherwise have had. The mystery deepens when we realize how many of these stories end in uncertainty. Some fugitives disappeared without a trace, leaving only rumors of their fate. Others were said to have died, but whispers suggested they lived on, hiding under new names. Villagers might tell children that the outlaw still roamed the forest, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Followers of a preacher might claim that their leader had ascended or escaped, spreading the faith in secret. Exiled rulers were always believed to be gathering armies, no matter how many years had passed since they had vanished. This uncertainty created legends that outlived the individuals themselves. In truth, the medieval world thrived on mystery. For ordinary people, life was hard, and stories of fugitives gave them something to hold on to. They were proof that power was not absolute, that even kings could be defied, and that a single person could unsettle an entire kingdom. For those in power, the stories were far more troubling. They saw them as dangerous seeds, capable of growing into rebellion. That is why the words "most wanted" carried such heavy weight. They were not only about catching a fugitive, but about silencing an idea before it spread too far. The deeper we step into this history, the more we see the human cost. Families broken apart, towns punished for hiding rebels, soldiers sent on endless hunts through hostile lands. The pursuit of the wanted was a story of survival, not only for fugitives, but for those caught in their orbit. To help a hunted person was to risk your own safety. To betray them was to live with the guilt or the reward that came after. Every decision, every whispered word carried consequences. And in this constant tension, lives were shaped, communities torn, and stories written into history. But even with all the dangers, some chose to help. Why? Perhaps because they saw something in these fugitives that they admired, or perhaps because they were desperate for change themselves. A farmer giving bread to an outlaw was not simply feeding a man. He was feeding the idea of resistance. A villager offering shelter to a preacher was not only showing kindness, she was allowing words to spread further. These quiet acts of defiance made fugitives harder to catch and their legends harder to erase. And so, as we prepare to meet the first of these figures in detail, we carry with us this understanding. Being most wanted was more than just a punishment. It was a mirror of the age itself, reflecting its struggles, its fears, and its hopes. Each fugitive was a thread pulled loose from the fabric of society, and once pulled, the whole tapestry seemed to unravel. That is why their names mattered then, and why they still matter now. The night deepens, and the stories grow closer. Somewhere in the shadows of history, a name waits to be spoken, a name that will draw us deeper into this world of chases, secrets, and rebellion. But whose name will it be? That question remains just out of reach, lingering like a torchlight flickering at the end of a darkened hall, pulling us forward into the mystery still to come. The torchlight at the end of that hall burns brighter now, and as we walk closer, we begin to hear footsteps echoing in the dark. Those steps belong not just to one person, but to many, because medieval history is filled with the sound of fugitives moving quickly, trying to stay ahead of the power that sought to crush them. Among them, certain names stand out, and one of the most enduring is that of Robin Hood. Whether he was a real man, a combination of different outlaws, or entirely a legend, the stories surrounding him capture the spirit of what it meant to be most wanted. Imagine the dense green forests of England, where sunlight barely reached the mossy floor, and where whispers carried farther than shouts. In those woods, ballads say, Robin Hood and his band of followers lived outside the law. To the crown and the sheriffs, he was a criminal, someone who defied authority, refused to pay homage, and embarrassed officials by constantly escaping their grasp. To the poor, though, he became a symbol of hope, a figure who turned the rules upside down by taking from the powerful and giving to those who had nothing. That contrast made him dangerous in more ways than one. But whether or not Robin Hood truly lived, his legend reflects a wider truth. Medieval outlaws were often born from injustice. Harsh taxes, land disputes, and corrupt officials drove many into the forests. A farmer who lost his field could become a fugitive overnight if he resisted. A soldier dismissed without pay might turn to robbery, not out of greed but out of hunger. These men, once pushed beyond the protection of the law, found that the only way to survive was to fight against it. And once they did, the law came down on them with all its force. To be declared an outlaw in medieval England, or anywhere in Europe, was to be stripped of all rights. You could not seek protection from the courts. You could not own property. You were fair game for anyone who wished to harm you. And yet, despite this grim fate, many chose that life over submission. Why? Because for some, freedom in the forest was better than bondage under a lord. That choice carried a strange kind of dignity, even if it came with danger. While stories like Robin Hood's may seem romantic now, at the time they created fear among rulers. Each tale of a sheriff tricked, each rumor of wealth redistributed, made authority look weaker. If people admired the outlaw more than the noble, what did that mean for the balance of power? It meant cracks were forming, and rulers could not afford to ignore them. And yet, Robin Hood was not the only shadow haunting the medieval age. Across the continent, other figures were becoming most wanted, though for very different reasons. Some were not outlaws of the forest, but thinkers, writers, and preachers. The church was one of the most powerful institutions of the medieval world, and to challenge its teachings was to invite danger. Those labeled heretics were pursued with the same intensity as robbers or rebels. One such figure was Jan Hus, a preacher from Bohemia in the early 1400s. Hus spoke openly against corruption in the church and called for reform, earning him the devotion of many common people but the fury of church authorities. He was summoned to a council, promised safe conduct, and yet was imprisoned and eventually executed. In life, he was most wanted. In death, he became a martyr whose words continued to spread long after his silence. His story shows us that the most wanted label was not only for thieves and rebels, but also for voices that unsettled the status quo. The same was true of many others, wanderers who carried ideas instead of swords, and who were hunted because words, too, could topple kingdoms. Books were burned, sermons silenced. Yet the hunger for truth or fairness drove people to listen in secret. These figures remind us that being most wanted did not always mean being violent. Sometimes it meant being bold enough to speak when silence was demanded. Between the outlaw in the forest and the preacher in the pulpit, the medieval world was never at peace. Both represented different kinds of rebellion, yet both were feared because they proved that order was fragile. Kings could send armies into the woods, and bishops could condemn heretics, but the stories and ideas could not be fully destroyed. They spread from mouth to mouth, from village to village, growing stronger each time someone tried to stamp them out. And then there were those whose very blood made them fugitives. Exiled princes, claimants to thrones, and rulers cast aside by rivals often found themselves most wanted simply because they posed a threat to those in power. A prince with a claim to the crown could rally armies, even in exile. An empress cast out could inspire loyalty that outlasted a reign. These figures lived in constant tension, never safe, always watched, because their existence alone carried danger. One striking example was Empress Matilda in the 12th century. The daughter of King Henry I of England, she was named as heir, but when her cousin seized the throne after Henry's death, she was forced into years of conflict. Her story was one of pursuit and escape, of sieges and betrayals, and though she never fully claimed the crown herself, her persistence shaped the future of England through her son, who became King Henry II. Matilda's life shows that being most wanted was not reserved for those outside the law. Sometimes even those born to rule were hunted when power slipped from their grasp. When we place these figures side by side, the outlaw, the heretic, the exile, we begin to see the larger picture. The medieval world was a place where authority was constantly challenged, sometimes with swords, sometimes with words, sometimes simply by existing. Each challenge brought with it a chase, a desperate attempt by rulers to regain control. Each fugitive carried not only their own story, but the fears of those in power. And yet, what binds them all together is the human element. We can imagine Robin Hood laughing in the trees, confident for now, but always aware that soldiers might be on his trail. We can picture Jan Hus, writing carefully, knowing that each word edged him closer to danger. We can see Empress Matilda, escaping under the cover of night, cloaked in white to vanish into the snow. These moments bring the past alive, reminding us that behind the titles and accusations were human beings, full of courage, doubt, and hope. But we have only begun to uncover the layers of this world. The medieval age has more shadows to reveal, more fugitives whose names linger at the edges of memory. Some disappeared without a trace, leaving only mystery behind. Others faced capture and defied their fate to the very end. As we move forward, the stories will grow darker, the tension heavier, as we step closer to those who carried the greatest weight of being most wanted. And somewhere, hidden still in the folds of time, lies a story even greater, one that we have not yet told. A tale that holds the key to understanding why these figures continue to haunt history, and why the chase never truly ended. Conflict in a medieval world was never simple. And when we look at the most wanted figures of the age, we see that their lives were tangled in webs of politics, faith, and survival. A fugitive was not only fighting against soldiers or sheriffs, they were struggling against entire systems. And those systems were built to endure, to crush any challenge, no matter how small it first appeared. This is where the heart of the conflict lies, between power that demanded obedience and the individuals who dared to resist. Take the story of William Wallace, a name that still echoes through Scotland's valleys and hills. To the English crown, he was a traitor, a man who stirred rebellion and defied authority. But to his own people, he was a symbol of freedom, a leader who gave voice to their anger against heavy taxation and foreign rule. The English saw him as dangerous because he turned discontent into action, leading attacks that struck at their control. Wallace's conflict was not just with soldiers on the battlefield. It was with the very idea that one nation could dominate another. His wanted status made him larger than life, but it also painted a target on his back so clear that every ally risked betrayal and every shadow carried danger. In another part of Europe, Owain Glyndwr faced a similar path centuries later. In Wales, his uprising against English authority echoed Wallace's fight, fueled by a longing for independence and dignity. Owain became most wanted not only for the battles he fought, but for the dream he represented. To the English lords, he was a criminal who needed to be hunted until no trace remained. To the Welsh, he was a prince who carried their hopes. The deeper conflict was not just military. It was cultural, emotional, and spiritual. It was about identity, about a people who refused to be silenced. Yet, the more his rebellion burned, the harsher the hunts became. The wanted man and his followers faced not only swords but starvation, betrayal, and the slow erosion of hope. While warriors like Wallace and Glyndwr fought with steel, others carried their battles into the realm of faith. The heretics and preachers who defied church authority faced an invisible battlefield. For them, the conflict was over ideas, truth, salvation, justice. A single sermon could ignite as much fear in bishops as a sword could in kings. The subplots of these voices were deeply personal. Imagine a small group gathered in a candlelit room, listening to a preacher declare that faith should not be bound by wealth or hierarchy. Each listener knew that if discovered, punishment would fall not just on the speaker, but on them as well. The church, for its part, saw heresy as poison, something that spread quickly if not stopped. And so the conflict between belief and authority became one of the most dangerous struggles of the age. We cannot forget either the role of ordinary people in this conflict. A farmer who gave bread to Wallace's men, a villager who offered shelter to Owain's rebels, a woman who allowed a preacher to hide in her home, all became part of the struggle. Their choices were small, but carried weight. To help was to risk everything. To betray was to preserve safety, but live with shame. Each decision deepened the story, creating layers of tension where loyalty and fear clashed. Nobles and rulers, too, found themselves trapped in the same struggle. A baron might quietly admire Wallace or secretly resent English authority, yet remain loyal out of fear of losing land. A bishop might believe some of the heretics' words, yet condemn them publicly to protect his own position. These figures lived in gray areas, torn between conviction and survival. Their silence or betrayal often shaped the fate of those most wanted more than swords ever did. What makes this conflict even more striking is how quickly fortune could change. A fugitive might be celebrated one day, only to be betrayed the next. A preacher might find thousands willing to listen, then suddenly be arrested and dragged to trial. The medieval world was a place of uncertainty, where trust was fragile and alliances thin. Every outlaw, every rebel, every heretic knew that capture could come at any moment, not only from the soldiers chasing them, but from those closest to them. Suspicion and fear were constant companions, making every step forward a gamble. The subplots that grew out of this tension add depth to the larger conflict. Families of fugitives often paid the price, stripped of land or punished for harboring traitors. Villages suspected of offering shelter could be fined or burned. These punishments created a cruel cycle, forcing people to choose between compassion and safety. In this way, the conflict spread beyond the individual fugitive, staining entire communities. To live in such times was to be caught between survival and solidarity, never sure which choice would bring more suffering. Yet even as the fugitives faced such crushing odds, their legends began to grow. Every daring escape, every fiery sermon, every midnight raid became part of their story. The more they were hunted, the more people talked. In taverns, around hearths, in whispered prayers, their names lived on. This was the great irony. The harder rulers tried to erase them, the more unforgettable they became. The very conflict that threatened their lives ensured their memory endured. And still, we have not resolved the heart of the story. These figures lived in a world where the weight of authority was immense, but so too was the human desire for freedom, justice, or simply dignity. The fugitives were hunted, yes, but they also hunted something themselves. They hunted fairness. They hunted recognition. They hunted a place where they could live without chains. This is what gives their stories such power even now. But the path ahead in this tale only grows darker. The tension does not ease, it builds. The walls of power close in, the forests grow colder, and the whispers of betrayal grow louder. We know capture is always possible, but what we do not yet know is how each story will end. Will the fugitive slip away once more into the shadows, or will the hunter finally strike? That question lingers, heavy and unresolved, waiting in the silence of the medieval night. The walls of power always seem to grow higher the longer a fugitive remained free. For every outlaw roaming the forests, every rebel building an army, and every preacher refusing to bow, there was always a hunter somewhere close behind. Capture was not a single moment, but a slow, drawn-out threat that clung to the air like fog. It was in the sound of hoofbeats echoing through a quiet valley, in the knock at the door that came too late at night, in the familiar face that suddenly seemed untrustworthy. The hunted never truly rested. Even in moments of victory, the shadow of betrayal lingered. Consider again the life of William Wallace. After his early triumphs, where he and his men struck fear into English forces, his movements became narrower. The countryside that once protected him began to betray him, not through malice, but through necessity. People under English control faced brutal consequences for sheltering rebels. A family offering food could lose their farm. A village offering safety could face punishment from soldiers. Fear spread faster than loyalty, and slowly the spaces Wallace could safely tread began to vanish. His most wanted status had become heavier than his sword. The conflict was no longer only about battle. It was about survival against time, fear, and hunger. Betrayal, too, was never far away. The higher the reward placed on a fugitive's head, the greater the temptation for those close by. A loyal follower might hold fast for years, but desperation has a way of breaking even the strongest bonds. To betray a fugitive was to trade danger for safety, poverty for reward. Yet, it was also to trade loyalty for guilt, and that guilt often haunted those who made the choice. History remembers Wallace's betrayal not with honor, but with bitterness, for his end was tied to the weakness of someone who once swore to stand with him. The same pattern repeated across Europe. Owain Glyndwr fought for years in the hills of Wales, slipping through the fingers of those who hunted him. He inspired men and women to join his cause, and for a time, he seemed untouchable. Yet the crown pressed harder, sending armies, burning villages, tightening the grip. Slowly, his rebellion crumbled. Some of his followers abandoned him. Others were captured, and though he was never officially caught, his disappearance became its own kind of capture. His name lived on, but his body vanished into mystery, leaving questions that have never been answered. Was he betrayed, or did he simply fade into the hills, a fugitive until the end of his days? The suspense of not knowing lingers, keeping his story alive centuries later. For those whose weapon was faith instead of steel, capture often came quietly. Jan Hus, for example, was promised safety when called to defend his ideas. Yet safety was a thin veil, torn away the moment he arrived. Imprisonment followed, then trial, then execution. His followers believed betrayal came not only from men, but from the very promises of authority. His death was not the end of his message, but the sharpening of it. For the church, it was meant to silence him. For the people, it only deepened their resolve. Capture, in this sense, backfired. The hunter's victory created a martyr, and the fugitive's spirit walked further than his feet ever had. Even nobles who once held power faced capture when their fortunes shifted. Empress Matilda, in her struggle for the English crown, found herself trapped more than once. One of the most striking stories tells of her escaping a siege by cloaking herself in white during winter, slipping unseen across the snow. That image, an empress, once destined to rule, reduced to fleeing under cover of night, shows how fragile power was in the medieval world. To be most wanted was not only to be hunted by enemies, but to be forced into constant disguise, into decisions that chipped away at dignity, yet kept life intact. But the conflict was not only between fugitive and hunter. Within the heart of each fugitive, another battle raged. The struggle to remain true to cause while weighed down by fear. The guilt of dragging families and followers into danger. The knowledge that survival might demand cruelty or sacrifice. All of these lived side by side. Wallace surely felt the burden of seeing villages burned because of his rebellion. Huss must have felt the fear of leading others into peril for his words. Matilda must have wondered if her claim to the throne was worth the suffering it caused her allies. These inner conflicts deepened the outer ones, adding layers to their stories that made them more human, more relatable, and more tragic. Subplots emerged constantly from these struggles. In the villages, mothers told their children tales of the fugitives as heroes, even while warning them to never speak of it aloud. In the castles, nobles debated quietly whether to side with rebels or to stay loyal to the crown. Among the soldiers, whispers spread. Some admired the fugitives they were ordered to hunt, others dreamed of rewards, and some simply longed for peace. The tension was everywhere, pressing into the lives of people far beyond those named in decrees. The chase itself became a rhythm of the age. Riders thundering down muddy roads, soldiers combing through forests, spies listening in marketplaces. Fugitives lived in constant motion, never too long in one place, never fully safe. Each move was a gamble. A wrong turn could mean capture, but staying still too long meant discovery. This endless flight gave the medieval world an air of restless unease, where the hunted shaped the hunters as much as the hunters shaped the hunted. And yet, despite all this danger, fugitives found ways to strike back. Wallace fought battles that are still remembered. GLYNDWR held out so long that even the English crown grew weary. Huss left behind words that spread further than any army could march. Matilda's persistence ensured her bloodline returned to the throne. These acts of defiance kept hope alive, even as the noose of power tightened. Still, the conflict has not yet reached its end. The hunters continue to ride, the fugitives continue to flee, and betrayal waits in the shadows. Every story bends toward a conclusion, but here in the heart of the medieval struggle, we remain suspended in the chase. The fugitives are not yet caught, the hunters are not yet triumphant, and the people caught in between still whisper, still wonder, still wait. Because somewhere in this web of fear and defiance lies the greatest question of all, not just who will survive, but whose story will endure. And that answer, for now, remains hidden in the darkness of the medieval night. The darkness of the medieval night only thickens as we move deeper into the tales of the most wanted. Their lives, like burning torches, cast light for a brief moment before the winds of power try to snuff them out. But the more the rulers tried to extinguish them, the brighter the flame seemed to glow in the memory of those left behind. What made these stories so gripping, even centuries later, was not only the deeds of the fugitives, but the way their downfalls unfolded. Each capture or disappearance carried drama, betrayal, and the lingering question of whether justice had truly been served, or whether injustice had simply been written into the records of the victors. Take William Wallace once again. His capture is remembered with bitterness, not because he fell in battle, but because he was betrayed. For years he had evaded the English, his movements hidden by those who sympathized with him. Yet all it took was one person, tempted by reward or pressed by fear, to deliver him into the hands of his enemies. Imagine the moment. Wallace, weary from years of fighting, perhaps believing himself safe for the night, suddenly surrounded by men who had once claimed loyalty. The shock of betrayal cut deeper than any sword. From there, his fate was sealed, dragged to trial, condemned as a traitor, and executed in the most brutal fashion. Wallace's life ended as the crown demanded, but his legend began as the people remembered it. In the attempt to erase him, the English instead ensured he would never be forgotten. Owain GLYNDWRs and was less clear, yet just as haunting. Unlike Wallace, GLYNDWR was never captured. His rebellion faded, his armies scattered, and the English pressed tighter with every passing year. Villages that once shouted his name fell silent. His allies either died or bent the knee, and then, one day, GLYNDWR simply disappeared. No one knows for certain what happened to him. Some say he fled into the wild hills, living out his days in hiding, a hunted prince who refused to surrender. Others whisper he was betrayed and quietly executed, his death hidden to deny his followers a martyr. The lack of certainty is what makes his story endure. The mystery itself became part of his legend, leaving every Welsh valley with its own tale of his final fate. Was he a ghost on the run, or a man who chose silence over defeat? No answer was ever given, and so his wanted status never truly ended. The fate of heretics like Jan Hus unfolded differently. Betrayal came not from close companions, but from broken promises of authority. Hus had been assured safe passage to defend his teachings, yet the word of rulers meant little when fear of rebellion outweighed honor. Imprisoned, condemned, and burned, Hus became a symbol of both the danger and the power of speaking truth in a world where silence was demanded. His execution was meant to terrify others into obedience, but instead it inspired a wave of followers, the Hussites, who carried his ideas forward with even greater determination. In trying to silence him, the hunters gave his words wings. His story reveals how the conflict of faith in the medieval world could not be settled with fire. It only spread more flames. Even Empress Matilda's struggles show how capture and escape shaped the destinies of nations. She was trapped in Oxford, surrounded by enemy forces, her claim to the throne seemingly finished. Yet her escape was as daring as any outlaw's flight. Cloaked in white, she slipped into the snow-covered night, crossing enemy lines unnoticed. Though she did not ultimately take the crown for herself, her survival ensured her son would one day become king, shaping the very monarchy that had once tried to erase her. In her story, the conflict did not end with her downfall, but with the continuation of her bloodline, a quieter victory hidden within the chaos of her defeats. What ties these stories together is the way power sought to not only capture but to humiliate. Rulers understood that simply defeating a fugitive was not enough. They needed to make an example. Trials were staged publicly, punishments carried out with spectacle, and proclamations spread across villages and towns. To the authorities, this was justice. To the people, it often looked like cruelty. A rebel paraded through the streets in chains became not only a warning, but also a reminder of the courage it took to stand against the crown. A preacher burned at the stake became not only a heretic, but also a voice remembered long after the ashes cooled. This tension between the official story and the whispered memory kept the conflict alive, even after the individual's death. And yet, for every fugitive brought down, another seemed to rise. The medieval world was never free from unrest because the same conditions that created fugitives, oppression, corruption, hunger, ambition, remained. If Wallace fell, Glyndwr rose. If Huss was silenced, other preachers took up his cause. If Matilda was denied, her son reclaimed the throne. The cycle of pursuit and resistance continued endlessly, feeding the restless spirit of the age. The hunters might win battles, but they never truly won the war against memory and legend. Still, the moments of capture and betrayal cannot be ignored, for they are what gave these stories their weight. Imagine the fear in the hearts of fugitives as soldiers closed in, the sound of armored boots drawing nearer. Imagine the heavy silence in a village when a rebel was handed over, the shame and relief mixed together. Imagine the roar of a crowd at an execution, half in obedience, half in mourning. These are the human experiences that made the chase so unbearable, yet so unforgettable. And we must not forget the ordinary people whose lives were bound to these events. A farmer who once gave shelter to Wallace may have watched in horror as he was dragged away. A villager who saw Huss preach may have later stood in the crowd as he was condemned. A child who grew up hearing stories of Glyndwr may have spent a lifetime wondering if the prince still walked in the hills. These subplots remind us that the conflict stretched far beyond the fugitives themselves. It reached into kitchens, fields, and churches, shaping the way entire generations understood loyalty, faith, and fear. But for now, none of these stories are finished. The captures, the betrayals, the escapes, they only deepen the suspense. The fugitives may have faced their hunters, but the chase is not over, because their names continue to echo through history. What remains unresolved is the question of legacy. Were they criminals who deserved their fate, or heroes who paid the price for daring to resist? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, and it is that uncertainty that keeps their stories alive. The torches still flicker in the darkness of the medieval night. The hunters are still riding, and the fugitives, whether betrayed, captured, vanished, or defiant, remain forever one step ahead in memory. We have seen their struggles deepen, their downfalls approach, but the final reckoning, the point where their stories either break or transform into legend, still waits just ahead, beyond the horizon we cannot yet see. The storm of history always seems to gather most violently just before it breaks. For each of these fugitives, that storm came in the form of betrayal, desperate choices, and the relentless pressure of being hunted. The chase had gone on for years, sometimes decades, but every step seemed to lead toward one final confrontation where everything would be decided. The closer the walls closed in, the more the air seemed to tighten, as though the entire world held its breath waiting for the outcome. William Wallace's final days were filled with this crushing weight. For so long he had eluded capture, hiding among those who believed in him, fighting when the odds allowed, and vanishing into the mist when they did not. But by now the English had grown desperate, offering rewards that tempted even the most loyal of men. Each knock at the door, each whisper in the tavern, could be the start of betrayal. For Wallace, trust had become a knife with two edges, necessary to survive, yet dangerous enough to end him. When the betrayal came, it was sudden, cutting through the fragile hope he had held. The suspense of that moment still lingers across the centuries. A man who had shaken the mightiest crown in Europe, suddenly caught by those who had once sworn to stand beside him. The hunter and the hunted were about to meet face to face, and everyone knew it could only end one way. Owain Glwr's story built its own tension in a different, but equally haunting way. Unlike Wallace, Glwr was not betrayed in a single flash. Instead, his rebellion slowly bled away. The English tightened their grip, castles fell one by one, allies began to drift apart, and yet Glwr refused to surrender. His enemies were certain that capture was only a matter of time. Every patrol, every search party combing the Welsh hills, carried with it the possibility of ending the chase. And yet, somehow, he always slipped away. His ability to vanish turned him into something more than a man. He became a ghost haunting the crown, a reminder that the fight was not truly over. But the suspense grew heavier with each year he disappeared from sight. Where was he? Was he hiding in a farmhouse, disguised as a peasant, or gone into the mountains never to be seen again? The uncertainty was almost unbearable, and it left his enemies more uneasy than if they had caught him. For Jan Hus, the tension was not built on narrow escapes, but on the slow tightening of the noose of power. Promised safe passage, he traveled under the belief that truth could defend itself if only given the chance to speak. But safe passage in the medieval world was as fragile as parchment in the rain. Each day he spent imprisoned, each whispered debate among the powerful men who would decide his fate carried the sense of inevitability pressing in closer. The crowds who had once listened to his sermons waited for news, fearing the worst. Huss himself must have known what was coming, yet still clung to the faint hope that reason might prevail. The suspense was not only about whether he would live or die, but whether his voice would survive the flames that threatened to consume him. Even Empress Matilda's tale reached a breaking point that seemed impossible to escape. Surrounded by enemy forces at Oxford, winter pressing down with icy fingers and supplies dwindling, she seemed cornered at last. Her claim to the throne hung in the balance, her supporters restless, her enemies ready to declare victory. The soldiers outside her walls knew it was only a matter of time before hunger or desperation forced surrender. Yet Matilda was not a woman known for surrender. The tension of those nights must have been unbearable. Every creak of the gate, every shadow across the snow might have meant discovery. The hunters were waiting, confident the chase was ending. They had no idea that one of the most daring escapes in history was about to unfold. But in that moment of suspense, everything still hung in doubt. What makes these stories so gripping is the way they all seem to hover on the edge of resolution, but never quite fall. Betrayal waits in the shadows, yet loyalty lingers. Capture seems certain, yet escape remains possible. Promises are made, yet broken before the ink has dried. The fugitives and their pursuers are caught in a deadly dance, and neither side can afford a single misstep. Each choice, whether to trust, to fight, to flee, or to speak, carries consequences that might tip the balance forever. For the people watching from the outside, the tension was just as real. Villagers whispered about sightings, passing along rumors like sparks in the dark. Supporters held their breath, wondering if the fugitive they had aided would survive another night. Enemies sharpened their swords, eager to claim the reward. Every person caught in this web felt the suspense, because the outcome would shape not only the fate of one fugitive, but the future of kingdoms, faith, and power itself. And so the stories of Wallace, Glwr, Huss, and Matilda marched toward their climaxes with unbearable weight. The betrayals tighten, the walls close in, the promises collapse, and the hunters draw near. What remains unknown is whether each fugitive will stand defiant, vanish in a legend, or be broken by the hands of their enemies. We can almost hear the boots approaching, the doors splintering, the torches flaring against the night. The tension hangs heavy, unresolved, as though history itself pauses in anticipation of the moment when the chase must finally end. The night air in medieval Europe was never silent. Dogs barked in the distance, men's boots crunched over gravel roads, and the wind carried the sound of horns that often meant soldiers on the move. For those who lived as fugitives, these noises were louder than thunder. They were reminders that capture could come at any moment. As the walls of fate pressed closer, each of our figures seemed to stand at the very edge of the abyss, waiting for one final choice to decide whether they would be remembered as legends or erased as traitors. William Wallace's capture had set a chain of events in motion that made even his enemies uneasy. He was not simply a man anymore. He had become a symbol of resistance. The English knew that by parading him in chains, they could show their power, but they also feared what his defiance might spark. Every whisper in the crowd, every clenched fist in the marketplace, showed that his story was not ending quietly. The suspense thickened as Wallace was carried toward his fate, not knowing if his courage would inspire fear or rebellion once the final act was done. Meanwhile, Owain Glyndwr continued to haunt his pursuers. His rebellion had crumbled, his castles had fallen, yet his shadow stretched across Wales like a storm cloud refusing to lift. The English searched tirelessly, setting ambushes in the hills, bribing shepherds for information, and spreading fear to break the loyalty of his followers. And yet, night after night, he vanished into the mist. Some swore they saw him disguised as a farmer. Others whispered he had crossed the seas, and still others believed he had simply walked into the mountains, never to return. But each rumor carried the same weight. He could be anywhere, and the fear of him lingered longer than his rebellion. The tension of his story lies not only in the battles he fought, but in the silence he left behind. For his hunters, that silence was unbearable. For Jan Hus, the suspense was more suffocating than any prison cell. The council where his fate was decided gathered the most powerful men of faith and politics, their voices rising in heated debate. Some argued for mercy, others demanded silence at any cost. Hus himself was brought before them, asked to renounce his words, to bend under the pressure of authority. Each pause in the chamber, each rustle of robes, held the weight of centuries of tradition and fear. The promise of safe passage, which had brought him to this place, had already begun to feel like a cruel joke. But Hus did not yield. His refusal turned the council chamber into a theater of suspense, every word carrying the question of whether truth could survive when power stood against it. Empress Matilda's siege at Oxford built its tension not in the roar of battles, but in the slow, gnawing hunger of winter. The snow pressed against the castle walls, the river froze, and the stores of food dwindled with each passing day. Outside, enemy soldiers watched with cold patience, certain that no one could escape. Yet Matilda still walked the halls with unshaken resolve. Her allies whispered desperate plans, her enemies sharpened their blades, but time was running out. The suspense of her plight lay in the sheer impossibility of escape, in the knowledge that every eye was waiting for her surrender. And still, Matilda had not spoken that word. Somewhere in her silence, in her calm defiance, was the hint of something no one expected. These threads of suspense, drawn tight by betrayal, capture, hunger, and silence, wove themselves into the fabric of medieval history. Each fugitive seemed to carry the weight of a kingdom on their shoulders, each step toward their climax echoing across villages, towns, and battlefields. For the common people, these stories were not distant tales, but lived realities. A farmer might shelter a rebel one night, only to face soldiers the next morning. A preacher might echo Huss's words in a quiet sermon, knowing the risks. A soldier might look into the snowy night, imagining Matilda's escape, but never daring to say it aloud. Suspense did not just belong to the famous. It lived in every heart caught between loyalty and survival. And so, history drew closer to the breaking point. Wallace's final defiance, Gilles vanishing act, Huss's trial, and Matilda's siege were all reaching moments where decisions could not be delayed. Each step, each word, each whisper seemed to build toward a single instant when everything would collapse or transform. The hunters believed they were closing in, yet history reminds us that the most dangerous moment is often when the prey seems cornered. The cliff loomed before them, the storm raged around them, and still the ending had not yet come. The air thickened with waiting. Would Wallace's courage ignite rebellion, or be crushed under the weight of punishment? Would GlynDWR ever reappear, or remain a ghost whose presence unsettled kings? Would Huss's defiance echo beyond the council walls, or vanish in silence? Would Matilda surrender, or attempt the impossible? These questions hung like swords over the heads of all who watched, unresolved, sharp, and ready to fall. The story balanced on the edge, holding both hunters and hunted in its grip. And just when the world expected finality, the fugitives' last move, the betrayal, the trial, the disappearance, or the escape, was about to shatter the silence of history. The night seemed darker than usual, as though even the moon wanted to hide its face from what was about to happen. In villages and castles alike, whispers spread like wildfire. The hunters were closing in. The fugitives, once untouchable, once larger than life, were now standing at the edge of their stories, pressed against the limits of fate. The tension that had been building for years was no longer just a murmur. It was a roar, and it demanded to be answered. William Wallace's march into captivity was the stuff of both horror and legend. Shackled, surrounded by soldiers, he passed through streets filled with onlookers. Some cursed him, others bowed their heads in silent respect, and still others clutched their children closer, uncertain if they were witnessing the fall of a criminal or the martyrdom of a hero. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, each clatter of chains building toward a climax no one could stop. The English crown wanted to send a message that rebellion would be crushed, but the suspense lay in the question of whether Wallace's final stand would extinguish resistance or fan it into something even greater. He had become a man whose voice carried louder in silence than in words, and the world waited to see what that silence would cost. In Wales, the mystery of Owain GlynDWR deepened. His rebellion had burned bright and fierce, but now only embers remained. Yet those embers refused to die. English patrols scoured the hills, castles stood ready to hold him if he were ever caught, and rewards promised wealth to anyone who betrayed him. But time after time, he slipped through their fingers. The tension came not from battles, but from absence. Where was he? Was he watching from the shadows as his enemies tightened their grip on his people? Was he gone, lost forever in the wilderness? Or was he plotting one last, desperate strike that might set the world ablaze again? The suspense of his story hung not on action, but on uncertainty, the kind that gnaws at the mind and refuses to let go. Jan Hus, meanwhile, faced the most dramatic kind of climax, a trial where words, not swords, determined the outcome. Brought before the council, he was asked once more to renounce his teachings. The chamber fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. The promise of safe conduct hung in the air, broken but still spoken of in hushed tones. If Huss recanted, he might live, but at the cost of everything he had stood for. If he stood firm, the outcome was certain and grim. The tension of the moment was unbearable. Each pause in his speech, each measured word, carried the weight of thousands who had listened to him preach. His enemies leaned forward, eager for his fall. His supporters prayed for his courage. Suspense did not just rest on what would happen to him, but on what would happen to the truth itself. Could one man's voice withstand the full force of the most powerful council in Europe? Empress Matilda's siege at Oxford was no less fraught. Snow blanketed the ground, cutting off supplies, freezing the river, and pressing despair into every corner of the castle. Her enemies waited outside, confident they would finally crush her claim. Her allies inside whispered of hopelessness, urging surrender. But Matilda's eyes did not flicker with defeat. Rumors grew in the freezing silence, that she was planning something unthinkable, something no enemy could expect. Soldiers outside tightened their watches, doubling the guards, certain that the end was at hand. Inside, the suspense built with every passing night, as Matilda seemed to grow calmer even as hunger deepened. It was as though she knew a secret no one else could imagine. All across the medieval world, the tension of these stories gathered into a storm. The people who lived through them could feel it. Peasants at their hearths whispered of fugitives who might be nearby. Soldiers sharpening their blades wondered if they would face an enemy in battle, or chase a ghost who would never be caught. Kings and councils tightened their fists, knowing that the balance of power could shift in a heartbeat. The suspense was not only about individual lives, but about kingdoms, faith, and the order of the world itself. For Wallace, GLYNDWR, Huss, and Matilda, the climax of their journeys was not only personal, but symbolic. They were hunted not simply for who they were, but for what they represented. Wallace stood for defiance against foreign rule. GLYNDWR embodied the dream of a free Wales. Huss carried the dangerous idea that truth could stand against power. Matilda was the living challenge to a king's authority. The suspense that surrounded them was the suspense of history itself, waiting to see whether such ideas could survive in a world ruled by crowns and swords. And then came the moments everyone had dreaded or anticipated. The executioner's stage prepared for Wallace, the endless searches for GLYNDWR that always turned up nothing, the council chamber where Huss's fate balanced on a single answer, and the snow-covered walls of Oxford where Matilda's enemies waited for surrender. Each story had reached the razor's edge. A breath, a word, a single slip could determine everything. The air was thick with expectation. Would Wallace break under the crown's punishment, or defy them to the end? Would GLYNDWR's enemies finally corner him, or would his disappearance turn into a legend that never died? Would Huss bow before power, or would his defiance echo through the flames? Would Matilda surrender her cause, or attempt a daring escape that seemed impossible? The suspense lingered, heavy and unbroken. It was the pause before the storm, the stillness before thunder, the silence that comes when the world itself seems to wait. And in that silence, the climax of these fugitives' lives loomed closer, like a shadow stretching across the centuries. The silence before the storm was never truly empty. It carried with it the weight of fear, the tension of waiting, and the creeping knowledge that something unexpected was about to happen. Just when it seemed as though the stories of these fugitives had reached their final turn, history revealed another twist, reminding us that nothing in the medieval world was ever simple. Betrayals deepened, alliances shifted, and the line between victory and ruin grew sharper than ever. What had seemed like the inevitable end now wavered, as though fate itself were playing a crueler, more complex game. William Wallace, already broken in chains, was expected to pass silently into legend with his fate sealed. But even here, in the darkest of moments, a second twist unfolded. Instead of cowing the people into submission, his trial and humiliation spread whispers of rebellion faster than before. Crowds that came to witness his downfall did not all cheer. Some clenched their fists, others turned their faces away in grief, and still others carried his story back to Scotland with renewed fury. The English crown wanted to make him an example. Yet in doing so, they may have created a rallying cry that echoed longer than his sword ever had. The twist was cruelly ironic. By trying to erase him, they had etched his name even deeper into the memory of his people. Suspense lingered in the air, because the very act meant to end the fight might only have been its spark. For Owain, GLYNDWR, the twist came not from his enemies, but from within his own circle. Supporters who had once stood firm now began to fracture. Some swore loyalty until the end, while others, exhausted by war and weighed down by poverty, drifted toward compromise with the English crown. The betrayal that GLYNDWR feared was no longer a single act, but a slow erosion of trust. Villages once ready to shelter him now hesitated, unsure if his cause could still succeed. Yet this unraveling loyalty made his story even more unpredictable. If the rebellion was truly finished, why did GLYNDWR remain uncaptured? If he was gone, why did rumors continue to spread, sometimes placing him in two places at once? His hunters tightened their grip, believing the end was near, but the very absence of resolution kept the tension sharp. The twist was that GLWR's vanishing act became more powerful than his battles ever were, leaving enemies chasing a ghost and allies clinging to a hope they could not fully abandon. Jan Hus, too, faced an unexpected escalation. His trial had been assumed to be a straightforward affair, an accusation, a demand, a recantation, or a death sentence. But Hus refused to give the council what it wanted. Instead, he spoke with a calm certainty that unsettled his judges. The more they pressed him, the more unwavering he became. What should have been a display of authority turned into something more dangerous, a public display of defiance that shook the confidence of those in power. The twist here was not that Hus's fate was uncertain. Everyone knew what the outcome would be, but that his courage turned the council itself into a stage for history. The suspense grew not from whether he would live or die, but from the dawning realization that his words might outlive the fire waiting for him. His enemies wanted silence, but every sentence he spoke seemed to echo louder than before, raising the stakes far beyond one man's life. Empress Matilda's siege took its own shocking turn. For weeks, her enemies had waited for surrender, certain that no escape was possible. Snow had locked the world in ice, supplies were exhausted, and her castle seemed like a prison closing in around her. Yet, in the dead of night, she revealed a plan so daring it bordered on madness. Dressed in white to blend into the snow, she prepared to slip past enemy lines. The twist was not simply the audacity of the plan, but the silence with which it was carried out. No trumpets, no battle cries, only the muffled crunch of snow underfoot as she and her small band moved like shadows through the freezing darkness. Her enemies, who had grown confident in their siege, suddenly realized that the hunted could still turn the game upside down. Suspense now hung on whether she would make it past the soldiers who surrounded her or be discovered in the act, with everything lost in a single breath. These twists did not resolve the conflicts. They deepened them. Each fugitive, far from stepping quietly into their fate, found a way to unsettle expectations. Wallace's death became more than an execution. It became a spark. GLWR's disappearance turned from a defeat into a lingering question. Hus's trial shifted from a sentence into a message that refused to be silenced. Matilda's siege transformed from a hopeless trap into a daring gamble against impossible odds. The suspense only grew sharper because every twist showed that the hunters were never fully in control. For the people living in those times, the stakes felt heavier with each passing day. A farmer in Scotland might whisper Wallace's name at the risk of his life. A Welsh shepherd might still believe GLYNDWR would return. A student in Prague might copy Hus's words in secret, afraid to be caught. A knight loyal to Matilda might wait for her signal, knowing failure meant death. The second layer of conflict was not only between fugitives and crowns, but within the hearts of ordinary people, torn between fear of punishment and hope for something greater. History itself seemed to tighten its grip, pulling all of these stories toward a breaking point. The hunters had cornered their prey, yet the prey found ways to turn the hunt into something larger, more dangerous, more lasting. Each twist raised a question. What happens when the act meant to end a rebellion, silence a voice, or crush a claim instead makes it stronger? Suspense lingered like the cold breath of winter, because no one knew if these final moves would shatter the fugitives or transform them into legends. Would Wallace's death truly silence Scotland, or would his courage echo beyond the grave? Would GLYNDWR fade into obscurity, or would his ghostly absence keep Wales restless for centuries? Would Hus's defiance vanish in flames, or ignite a movement far greater than himself? Would Matilda's daring escape succeed, changing the tide of a war, or would it end in capture and ruin? The story stood at the edge of its climax, the tension stretched to breaking. The hunters believed they were moments away from victory, but the fugitives had shown that even in their darkest hours, the story was far from over. The stakes had risen higher than ever, and the final act loomed like a storm on the horizon, unseen but impossible to ignore. The storm was finally breaking. The air of suspense that had hung for so long now condensed into a single, unbearable pressure, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound like a drum and every shadow seem alive. The hunters had pursued their prey for years, through battles and betrayals, through sieges and trials, and now the climax of their stories loomed. Nothing could be delayed any longer. The fugitives and their enemies were about to collide in ways that would scar history itself. William Wallace's final hours were heavy with tension that no crown could contain. Dragged into the heart of England, he faced the full spectacle of punishment. The English crown believed that showing his suffering would stamp out rebellion, but they underestimated the way courage can live even in silence. As Wallace stood before the crowds, chained yet unbowed, every eye fixed on him, his hunters expected fear, but they found only defiance. His very presence turned the stage into a battlefield of wills, his voice gone quiet, but his spirit refusing to break. The suspense in that moment was not whether he would die, for that was certain, but whether his death would crush Scotland or ignite it in a greater resistance. The line between defeat and legend blurred, and the outcome trembled on the edge. In Wales, Owain Glyndwr's story reached a climax without a battlefield, without a council chamber, without even a capture body. His hunters scoured every valley, every mountain path, certain they would corner him at last. Yet, as months became years, his absence grew louder than his presence had ever been. The suspense of his fate was unbearable. How could the most wanted man in Wales simply vanish? Soldiers swore he was hiding in plain sight, disguised as a shepherd. Others insisted he had died quietly in a farmhouse, buried without a trace. But the most chilling rumor was that he still lived, waiting, biding his time, watching as his enemies celebrated too soon. The climax of his story was not a final confrontation, but the haunting realization that the chase had no ending. The hunters were left empty-handed, staring into shadows that would never give up their secret. Jan Hus faced the sharpest edge of all. Brought before the council for the last time, he was offered one final chance to renounce his teachings. The silence in that chamber stretched on endlessly, the weight of the entire church pressing down on one man's shoulders. The suspense clung to every word, every breath, every flicker of torchlight across the walls. Would he bend under the pressure, or would he stand firm, knowing the price? When he refused, the hall erupted in fury, and the climax of his defiance echoed through every corner. His fate was sealed, yet his enemies realized in that instant that they had not silenced him. They had amplified him. The fire that awaited him outside was no longer just a punishment. It was a stage where his final act would resonate far beyond the square. The climax was not in his fall, but in the way his voice refused to bow, even in the shadow of death. For Empress Matilda, the climax came in a frozen night where silence was both ally and enemy. Dressed in white, she stepped into the snow, her breath misting in the dark as she slipped past the guards who surrounded her castle. Every crunch of ice beneath her feet was a thunderclap in her ears. Soldiers stood only yards away, torches flaring against the dark, yet somehow she moved unseen. The suspense of each step was unbearable. One cough, one misstep, one unlucky glance, and her story would end in ruin. Yet the deeper she moved into the night, the stronger her resolve became. Her hunters, so certain of victory, had been outmaneuvered by the very woman they thought trapped. The climax of her tale was not just in her escape, but in the shockwave it sent across her enemies, proving that even a siege could not bind her spirit. These moments, different yet bound together, brought the fugitives' stories to their sharpest point. Each climax carried the same unbearable weight. The world watched, held its breath, and waited to see whether courage or cruelty would prevail. But none of them resolved cleanly. Wallace's defiance raised questions that echoed long after his body fell. GLWR's vanishing act left a mystery that haunted Wales for centuries. Huss's voice outlived the council that condemned him. Matilda's escape shattered the certainty of kings and reshaped the course of war. The suspense that had built for years now surged to its highest peak. The hunters had chased, the fugitives had fled, and both sides had poured everything into the pursuit. And yet, even as the climax unfolded, the endings refused to be neat. The tension still lingered, stretched to its breaking point, daring the world to decide what would come next. The medieval world had reached its fever pitch. The stories of Wallace, GLYNDWR, Huss, and Matilda stood poised at the very edge of history, their outcomes looming like thunderclouds that had yet to burst. Would these fugitives be erased by the power of kings, or would their defiance transform them into legends that no crown could silence? The answer waited just beyond the horizon, unseen but certain, pressing down with the weight of destiny. The air after the climax of each of these stories never fully cleared. It lingered, thick with the echoes of voices, footsteps, and choices that had already been made but never truly ended. The people of the medieval world carried those moments with them, some in whispers, others in chants, and many in silence. What began as the pursuit of fugitives became the shaping of legends, and those legends lived far longer than any crown or kingdom. The suspense did not vanish. It simply shifted, as though history itself was asking what would come next, and whether the hunters or the hunted had truly won. For William Wallace, the silence after his death was almost louder than the cheers of those who condemned him. The English thought his execution would bring closure, a final stamp of authority on a man who had dared to rise. Yet the opposite occurred. In Scotland, his story became firewood for every tavern tale, every whispered hope, every spark of rebellion yet to come. Mothers told their children about the man who would not bow, and farmers carried his memory like a shield. The suspense that once belonged to the battlefield now moved into hearts and homes. Would Scotland rise again? And if so, when? Wallace's hunters thought they had ended him, but what they had ended was only a man. His spirit had slipped their grasp. Owain Gellwing's absence grew heavier with every passing season. The countryside, once filled with soldiers combing the hills, slowly quieted, but no one believed he was truly gone. The Welsh whispered that he had become something larger than flesh, that had slipped beyond the reach of the English crown into a space between myth and memory. At markets, old men claimed to have seen him riding under the moonlight. Children swore he would return when Wales needed him most. The suspense never resolved because there was no body, no grave, no final line to his story. In truth, it was that emptiness that made his legend heavier than his presence ever had been. The hunters had caught nothing, and in failing, they created a figure who could never be chained. Jan Hus left behind not just questions, but movements. Those who watched his trial and execution carried his defiance into their villages and into the next generation. The council that had condemned him thought the fire would erase him, but it became a torch passed from hand to hand. Songs were written, not of his death, but of his refusal to bend. And from those songs came action, revolts, uprisings, entire armies marching under banners painted with the same faith that had once placed him in chains. The suspense that lingered was not whether Huss's story had ended. It was whether his enemies could stop the wave he had set in motion. The hunters had won their moment, but they had lost control of the story. Empress Matilda's escape through the snow did not end her fight. It transformed her from a besieged woman into a shadow slipping between kingdoms. Every road she traveled became a thread in the web of civil war. The suspense hung over England itself. Who would claim the throne? Her enemies had cornered her and nearly ended her rule in that frozen night. Yet in her escape, she had written a different truth, that the hunters could not always have the final word. The war dragged on, with victories and losses falling like dice. But her legend remained that of a woman who defied the trap laid for her. The suspense of her story stretched over years, until it no longer belonged only to her, but to her son, who would eventually take the throne and prove her defiance had not been in vain. When you step back and look at all these lives, it becomes clear that the medieval world thrived on suspense that never fully resolved. Kings, priests, soldiers, and spies all tried to capture not just people but ideas. Yet the fugitives they hunted, Wallace, Gwyndwr, Huss, Matilda, escaped in ways no sword or chain could prevent. Sometimes they escaped through death, sometimes through vanishing, sometimes through fire, and sometimes through sheer cunning in the snow. The hunters thought the chase was about capturing a body, but history revealed it was about capturing a story. And stories are the hardest prey of all. Even centuries later, the suspense clings to us. We lean in, wondering what it would have felt like to hear Wallace's voice rise above the crowd, or to walk with Matilda through the frozen silence, or to sit in the council chamber as Huss refused to break. We still ask the same questions their enemies asked in the moment. What happens when courage cannot be crushed? What happens when someone chooses to disappear rather than surrender? What happens when death is not the end, but the beginning of a legend? The most wanted people in medieval history became something more than names on a list. They became mirrors, reflecting the fears and hopes of everyone who lived in their time. To some, they were threats that had to be stopped at any cost. To others, they were symbols of freedom, of faith, of possibility. And to us, looking back, they are reminders that suspense is not just about waiting for what comes next. It is about living in the space between what was and what will be. That is why their stories still pull us in. They remind us that history is not neat or tidy. It is messy, uncertain, and unresolved. It is full of footsteps in the snow, fires in the square, whispers in the mountains, and voices that echo long after the walls that once held them have crumbled. The suspense is never fully gone because we're still here, still asking, still wondering what it all means. And so the question lingers, as it always does at the edge of these tales. Who was truly hunted and who truly escaped? The kings and councils thought they had one, but the names we remember are not theirs. We remember the fugitives. We remember the ones who carried the suspense into eternity. And their chase, their defiance, their unfinished endings still wait like shadows at the edge of history, daring us to step closer and listen. The final act of these medieval stories was never written with a steady hand. It came in bursts of fire, in whispers carried through valleys, in the quiet steps of those who escaped when no one thought it possible. The climax of their journeys was not one single moment, but a cascade of turning points that came together to show that even the most wanted people in medieval history could not be silenced by chains, crowns, or councils. For William Wallace, the ending seemed brutally clear. His body had been taken, his life extinguished before the eyes of thousands. Yet as the years passed, it became obvious that what the English had destroyed in the square was only the man, not the spirit that had carried Scotland. The very climax they thought was their victory turned into his greatest triumph. Scotland's fight for independence grew stronger, fueled by his memory, and soon Robert the Bruce would rise to claim victories in Wallace's name. The twist was not in Wallace's death, but in how that death gave Scotland more life than his captors could ever have foreseen. In trying to end him, they had crowned him a legend, and that legend was a sharper weapon than any sword. Owain Gwyndwr's climax was stranger still. His rebellion faded, his allies scattered, and yet his story refused to end. His hunters died without ever catching him, their triumph incomplete. The Welsh people carried his memory like a secret flame, waiting for him to return. Some said he had wandered into the hills, never to be seen again. Others believed he lived on, hidden among his people. The twist was that his greatest act of defiance was not leading an army or raising a banner, but disappearing altogether. In vanishing, he denied his enemies the satisfaction of closure. His hunters wrote records, built stories, and spread rumors, but they could not write his ending. The climax of his life became a void, a mystery that no one could resolve, and that uncertainty was more powerful than any capture could have been. Jan Hus's trial seemed to end with fire, but fire only carried his words further. His hunters believed the council chamber was the climax, that the moment he refused to recant would be his undoing. Yet the flames turned his defiance into a beacon. The very people who had condemned him saw Europe stir in ways they could not control. Movements grew, entire wars erupted, and armies marched under banners painted with his teachings. The twist was brutal irony. In killing him, the council had unleashed something far larger than a man. Hus had been hunted, chained, and silenced, yet his voice spoke louder after his death than it ever had before. His hunters won the battle, but lost the war, for the fire they lit burned long after their own names were forgotten. For Empress Matilda, the climax came in the tug of war over England's throne. She had endured betrayal, siege, and escape, each moment pulling her closer to triumph, but never quite granting it. Her hunters thought they had ended her power when they forced her to retreat, but her legacy turned that defeat into victory. Years later, it was her son who rose to the throne as Henry II, one of the most powerful rulers England had ever seen. The twist in her story was that the crown she never wore still became hers, passed on through blood and determination. Her hunters had mocked her as a failed claimant, but history revealed she had simply planted the crown where it would grow stronger. The climax of her struggle was not her escape through the snow, nor her defeats, but the unexpected triumph of seeing her line continue where others had fallen. Each of these fugitives found resolution in ways no one predicted. The hunters thought the climax was about capture, about forcing submission, about stamping out resistance. But the true climax lay in how the hunted reshaped the world even as they fell, disappeared, or endured. Wallace's voice rose from silence. GLWR's absence became presence. Hus's fire became faith. Matilda's retreat became a dynasty. None of these endings were neat, none were simple, and all left behind echoes that shook the medieval world long after their hunters were gone. The final twist, the one that binds them all, is that being the most wanted people in medieval history was never really about being caught. It was about being remembered. The kings, councils, and lords who hunted them sought control, but what they achieved instead was immortality for their enemies. By chasing them, they elevated them. By condemning them, they preserved them. By ending their lives, they ensured their legends would never die. And so the story closes on an irony sharper than any sword. The hunters won their victories in the moment, but history belongs to the fugitives. It belongs to Wallace, whose courage still shapes Scotland. It belongs to GLYNDWR, whose disappearance still haunts Wales. It belongs to Hus, whose defiance still echoes in faith. It belongs to Matilda, whose bloodline changed the English throne forever. The suspense that once clung to their fates now clings to us, as we ask what it means to be wanted, to be hunted, and to leave behind a story no crown can erase. When the dust of centuries finally settles over these stories, what remains is not the chase, nor even the punishments that followed, but the strange way these people linger in memory. Their names echo across time because their endings were not really endings at all. Instead, they became lessons, reminders, and quiet warnings stitched into the fabric of medieval history. And it is here, in the calm after the storm, that their true significance begins to appear. William Wallace, the Scottish knight turned outlaw, may have been executed with brutal certainty, yet his story never belonged only to his captors. It belonged to the people who whispered his courage to their children, to the soldiers who marched under banners of independence, to the dream of a nation that refused to vanish. Long after the trial and the spectacle, Wallace lived on as a symbol, a man who represented the possibility that even in the darkest hours, defiance could shine brighter than submission. His hunters believed they had ended the rebellion. Instead, they had ensured Scotland would carry his name as a promise. In every corner of the kingdom, the quiet hope of freedom rested on the memory of a man who had become larger than life. Owain Glyndwr's disappearance still unsettles the pages of history. His rebellion had faltered, his allies scattered, and yet his legacy grew in silence. For the Welsh, his absence became a presence. He was not seen, but he was felt, in stories passed down, in songs sung under starlight, in the stubborn belief that he would return when Wales needed him most. In a way, his hunters created the mystery themselves by failing to catch him. They left the people with no final image, no closure, and in that void, imagination flourished. The greatest twist in G.L. Wendy W.R.'s tale was not his victories or his defeats, but the way he slipped beyond reach, turning the unknown into his most enduring weapon. His shadow still stretches across history, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful ending is no ending at all. Jan Hus, standing in the council chamber, refusing to renounce his beliefs, seemed to have walked toward destruction. Yet the flames that consumed him only carried his words further. Where the council thought they had silenced him, they had instead unleashed a tide of voices inspired by his defiance. His followers carried his ideas into battles, into reforms, into revolutions that shook the very foundations of Europe. To the men who condemned him, Huss may have seemed like one more heretic to erase. But to the generations that followed, he was a martyr whose fire could not be put out. The great irony of his story is how completely his enemies lost control of the outcome. They believed his death would end the threat. Instead, it amplified it until history could never forget his name. Empress Matilda's story is a reminder that sometimes survival itself is the greatest triumph. She endured betrayals and humiliations, yet she walked through them with a strength that her enemies never fully defeated. Her escape in the snow was not the end, but a turning point, one that kept her claim alive even when the throne slipped through her fingers. The war she fought dragged on, but her determination left its mark in her son, who rose to the throne and carried her legacy forward. In the end, Matilda's triumph was quiet but immense. The hunters who once mocked her as powerless had unwittingly laid the path for her bloodline to dominate England's future. Her story reminds us that even when victory seems denied, endurance can write its own ending. Together, these tales form a strange pattern. The most wanted people in medieval history were pursued with all the force kings and councils could muster, yet they were never truly erased. Some became legends through their courage, others through their disappearance, others still through the echoes of their voices or the survival of their bloodlines. Their hunters wrote proclamations, built gallows, held councils, and sent armies, but what they could never do was control the way people remembered. In every case, the memory of the hunted outlasted the triumph of the hunters. What lingers most is the sense of irony. The powerful thought they had won. They thought they had ended rebellion, silenced voices, and broken wills. But what they achieved instead was something far different. They preserved the stories of those they feared most. They made sure their names would survive in history, not as criminals or rebels, but as figures of defiance, courage, and hope. Their legacy reminds us that power is never absolute. No matter how strong the crown, no matter how fierce the army, there is always a place where resistance can endure, sometimes in the body, sometimes in the voice, and sometimes in the legend that outlives both. And so the tension of their lives settles not into neat conclusions, but into lingering questions that have no final answer. What does it mean to win when your victory only strengthens your enemy's memory? What does it mean to lose when your defeat turns you into a legend that cannot be forgotten? These are the questions that echo when the torches burn out, when the snow melts from the fields, when the council chambers fall silent. The most wanted people of medieval history show us something both unsettling and comforting, that history is rarely finished. Their stories are not frozen in the past, but alive in the present because we are still telling them. We are still asking what it means to resist, to vanish, to endure, to defy. We are still caught in the suspense they left behind, the strange space between what happened and what it meant. And that suspense is what makes their stories timeless. So as we close our eyes and drift into the quiet of the night, We carry with us the figures who once stood at the edge of crowns and councils, hunted and hounded yet never truly broken. William Wallace, Owain GlynDWR, Jan Hus, Empress Matilda, each of them still walks with us in the shadows of memory. Their hunters are gone, their kingdoms dissolved, their wars ended. But the fugitives remain. Their names are still spoken, their stories still told, their suspense still alive. And perhaps that is the final twist of all, that the true victory of the most wanted people in medieval history was not survival of the body, but survival of the story. And as long as we whisper their names, they remain forever beyond the reach of those who once sought to capture them. When the stories of the most wanted people in medieval history are finally laid out before us, what strikes the heart most is not the sound of swords, the blaze of fire, or even the clash of armies. It is the quiet after, the silence that comes when the chase has ended, when the hunters have gone home, and when the world has moved forward, yet the memory of those once hunted continues to linger like smoke after a fire. These are not simply tales of rebellion and capture, but of how fragile power can be and how endurance, even in the most difficult moments, can leave a mark that lasts far longer than victory on a battlefield. Think of William Wallace. His body may have been taken, his life ended with cruelty, but what remained was not defeat. It was a story. A story of a man who stood when others bowed, of someone who risked everything for an idea greater than himself. His hunters thought they had destroyed him completely, yet the people of Scotland found strength in his courage long after the executioner's blade had fallen. Wallace lived on in their voices, in their hope, in the way his name became a symbol whispered in moments when freedom seemed out of reach. The quiet power of that story remains even now, centuries later, a reminder that courage can survive even when the man who carried it no longer can. Owain GlynDWR, too, belongs to this strange silence of history. No final sight of him was ever recorded. No grave bears his name. His enemies searched and searched, desperate to hold him up as proof of their victory, but they never found him. Instead, what they left behind was an empty space filled by stories, legends, and endless wondering. His disappearance became more powerful than his presence. In the stillness of Welsh hills, people believed he was hiding, waiting, preparing to rise again. That belief gave his name a life no army could erase. His hunters faded into the long list of forgotten men, while GlynDWR remained a shadow on the horizon, half man, half myth, and entirely unforgettable. Jan Hus's story is heavier, shaped by fire and faith. He could have bent, could have recanted, could have chosen survival. But he did not. He chose silence over surrender, flames over fear. And in doing so, he created something larger than the council who condemned him. His death was the end of his life, but not of his voice. That voice was carried by those who believed in him, by those who took up his teachings and built movements that reshaped Europe. The silence after his execution was not empty. It was filled with songs, sermons, and resistance. His hunters thought they had put out a spark, but they had lit a torch that burned long after their names were forgotten. Empress Matilda's tale lingers in another kind of quiet. The soft crunch of snow beneath her feet, the stillness of the night as she walked unseen past her enemies. Her escape was not the end of her struggle, but it was proof that she could not be caged. The years that followed were filled with more battles, more uncertainty, yet the persistence she showed lived on in her legacy. The crown she never wore still came to her bloodline, carried by her son who became one of England's strongest kings. Her story reminds us that sometimes victory does not come in the moment, but in what is built afterward. Her hunters may have trapped her in a castle, but they could not trap her determination. That determination lived on, reshaping England for generations. When we reflect on these stories together, a pattern forms. The most wanted people of the medieval world were remembered not because they were hunted, but because they endured. Some endured through open defiance, some through mystery, some through faith, and some through sheer persistence. Their hunters, armed with power, authority, and armies believed they held control. Yet in the end, control slipped through their fingers. The stories of the fugitives survived, while the names of their captors slowly dissolved into history's silence. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Power, no matter how absolute it seems in the moment, is never permanent. Crowns can be lost, armies defeated, councils dissolved. But a story, once carried in the hearts of people, can outlive them all. Wallace, GLYNDWR, Huss, Matilda, they remind us that history is not written only by the victors, but by the voices that refuse to be silenced. And there's something calming in that, something almost comforting, because their lives, filled with danger and uncertainty, still ended with a strange kind of peace, not for themselves perhaps, but for the stories they left behind. They remind us that even in times of great struggle, even when the odds are impossible, there's still a chance to leave behind something that endures. Not every battle is won with swords or fire. Some are won with memory, with endurance, with the quiet persistence of belief. As we think about them now, in the stillness of our own time, their voices seem softer, quieter, less like the clamor of rebellion, and more like the faint echo of footsteps leading us through history. Their tension, their suspense, becomes part of a larger calm, a reminder that the storms of the past eventually fade, leaving only stories to guide us forward. And perhaps that is why these tales, though filled with drama and conflict, make such fitting companions for sleep. Because they're not just about struggle, they're about survival, memory, and the way time softens even the hardest moments into whispers. So as the night deepens and the world grows quiet, we carry with us the names of those once most wanted, now most remembered. Wallace, who stood unbroken. GLYNDWR, who vanished in a legend. Huss, who chose fire over silence. Matilda, who walked unseen into the snow. Each of them left something behind that no hunter could ever capture. And in their stories, we find not only suspense, but peace. Perhaps the final twist is this. Their hunters won their battles, but the hunted won eternity. And it is in that truth, in that gentle irony, that we can finally let the story rest, not with fear or tension, but with the calm understanding that even the most hunted people can leave behind the most enduring legacies. The silence that followed the supposed resolution was unsettling. For those who thought the story had reached its end, there came another wave of unease, as if history itself refused to let go of its shadows. The people in the towns and villages began to notice things that did not add up. Records kept in monasteries mentioned names that were never supposed to be spoken again, names of fugitives believed to have been caught or executed, yet their presence seemed to linger in unexpected corners. A merchant swore he had seen a man matching the description of one of the most wanted figures long after the authorities had declared him dead. Others whispered of secret letters, coded messages carried across borders, suggesting that alliances were still being made in the dark. This raised the question of whether the conflicts had truly been resolved at all, or if what people were witnessing was simply the surface layer of something deeper and more dangerous. The hunters of the past had always believed that stamping out one rebellion, silencing one outlaw, or ending one conspiracy would bring peace. But history rarely works that way. Each act of violence, each betrayal, seemed to create echoes that carried forward. People began to wonder if they were not just watching individuals fight for power, but were instead caught in a cycle that no one could stop. For the common folk, this endless uncertainty was exhausting. Farmers who only wanted to harvest their crops without fear of raiders still heard footsteps in the night. Innkeepers who longed for peaceful travelers at their tables often found themselves caught in heated conversations between men who carried too many secrets. And mothers who told stories to their children at bedtime would pause before mentioning the names of certain figures, fearing the weight that those names carried even generations later. The strange part was that sometimes these most wanted figures were not seen as villains at all by the people. To the rulers, they were criminals, rebels, or enemies of order. But to the peasants who lived under crushing taxes or endless wars, they were something else, symbols of defiance, living proof that even the most powerful could be challenged. This double identity made them even harder to pin down. One man's outlaw could be another's savior. And in that murky space, legends continue to grow. As time moved forward, the story took an unexpected turn. There came rumors that some of the most dangerous figures had found ways to weave themselves into the very fabric of society. Instead of living in the forests or mountains, they had taken on false identities, disguising themselves as merchants, advisors, or even minor nobles. It was said that one outlaw had become so skilled at hiding in plain sight that he was advising the very king who had once sworn to bring him to justice. No one knew if it was true, but the thought of it unsettled people deeply. It meant that perhaps the true power of these most wanted figures was not in their swords or armies, but in their ability to outwit entire kingdoms. The authorities, of course, were not blind to these fears. They doubled their efforts, sending spies into places that had once been ignored, listening to whispers in taverns, and examining every letter for signs of secret codes. Yet the more they tried to chase the shadows, the more those shadows seemed to multiply. It was as if the story had reached a point where it could no longer be neatly tied up. The most wanted people of medieval times were no longer just individuals. They had become ideas, and ideas were far harder to capture. This constant chase created a kind of tension that spread across the land. A villager could be speaking to a stranger on the road and never know if that person was a fugitive in disguise. A traveling priest could carry messages hidden within his scripture, and no one would dare stop him for fear of offending the church. A wealthy noble could host a feast, and among the guests might be someone with a secret past, someone wanted by rulers across the land. Every encounter carried the weight of possibility, the sense that history itself was still unfolding in ways no one could predict. And then came the discovery that shocked everyone. In one of the monasteries that had long been thought of as neutral ground, a secret chamber was found beneath the stone floors. Inside were scrolls and letters bearing the seals of several figures long thought dead. These letters revealed alliances that no one had ever suspected. Rebels joining hands with former knights, spies secretly working for both sides, and names of people who betrayed their lords not for money, but for visions of a different future. The revelation was staggering. It meant that the true story had never been told, and perhaps never would be fully uncovered. Those who read the documents in secret knew that releasing them to the public would ignite chaos, but keeping them hidden meant allowing the lies of the past to continue. Some believed the scrolls were cursed, that they carried not just words but the restless spirits of those who had lived and died by them. Others thought the letters were proof that history's so-called villains had been far more complex than anyone realized. Were they really criminals? Or were they simply people who could see beyond their own time, punished for daring to dream differently? What unsettled everyone most, however, was that some of the names on the scrolls matched the families still living among them. The descendants of those once branded as criminals were walking freely in villages and castles, unaware that their bloodline carried the echoes of rebellion. This knowledge threatened to tear communities apart. Who could you trust if the neighbor you had known all your life was connected to one of history's most hunted? The tension grew heavier, and the story, which many thought had already ended with triumph and closure, was instead spiraling into something larger and far more uncertain. What had started as a chase for outlaws had turned into a centuries-long mystery, a reminder that the past does not stay buried, and that the figures once marked as most wanted had left behind more than fear. They had left behind a legacy that no one could escape. And so, even after what seemed like final victories and resolutions, the people of the medieval world found themselves once again caught in the grip of suspense. The questions lingered in their minds, keeping them awake at night, much like they keep us awake today. Were these men and women truly villains, or had they been written into history as such to serve the interests of the powerful? What secrets were still hidden, waiting to surface when the time was right? And most of all, who among them was still carrying forward the shadow of those most wanted people, shaping the future while everyone else believed the past was over. The story had not ended. It had only reached another threshold, a moment of silence before the next storm. And it was in that silence that the most unsettling thought began to grow. Perhaps the real climax of the tale had not even arrived yet. As the dust of centuries finally began to settle, people came to realize that the tales of the most wanted in medieval history were not just about outlaws, rebels, or fugitives hiding in the shadows. They were about ordinary human beings caught in extraordinary circumstances, people who were remembered not only for the trouble they caused, but for the mark they left on society. The climax of their stories had revealed just how tangled truth and myth could become. But the ending brought something else: perspective. The villagers who had once lived in fear of raiders or secret spies began to see the past as part of a larger pattern. What had once been frightening suddenly seemed instructive. The idea that history had never been about simple heroes or villains, but rather about flawed men and women making choices under pressure, gave comfort to those who had always wondered why such figures continued to fascinate. The scrolls uncovered in the monastery were eventually sealed away again, but their contents had already changed how people thought about the past. It was no longer a tale of good versus evil, but of human struggle, ambition, and survival. Families who discovered their ties to those who had once been hunted learned to embrace the complexity of their heritage. Instead of feeling shame, many began to tell the stories of their ancestors with pride, highlighting their courage, their defiance, and their ability to endure. Where once the name of a rebel might have been whispered only in fear, it was now spoken as a reminder of resilience. The stigma faded, replaced by an understanding that every generation carries both light and shadow, and that sometimes the ones branded as dangerous were the very people who kept alive the possibility of change. The kings and rulers, too, learned their lessons, though often reluctantly. They realized that chasing shadows only fed the legends, and that the harder they tried to erase a name, the more it burned itself into memory. By the end, they understood that power does not always win, and that those who resist, even when defeated, can leave behind a legacy stronger than any crown or castle. In a strange way, the rulers who had feared these figures the most ended up cementing their immortality by declaring them enemies. The common people, who had once been silent witnesses to these struggles, found their own strength in retelling the stories. Around hearths, in taverns, and in marketplaces, these tales became woven into the fabric of everyday life. They were not just warnings or legends, but lessons about courage, betrayal, hope, and survival. For the weary farmer, the outlaw who defied unfair taxes became a symbol of justice. For the young squire, the knight who broke his oath for a higher calling became a model of integrity. For the innkeeper, the spy who risked everything to protect others was a reminder of loyalty. With time, the tension that had built for so long gave way to a sense of closure. The secret letters no longer carried fear, but knowledge, and knowledge was something people could use to move forward. Those who had lived in fear of being watched or betrayed began to sleep easier, knowing that the ghosts of the past were finally understood. The wanted men and women of medieval times were no longer nameless shadows, but part of a broader history that belonged to everyone. The surprising twist, however, was that while the direct conflicts were resolved, the spirit of defiance lived on in new forms. Centuries later, when new rulers rose and new struggles began, people looked back at these medieval figures not as criminals, but as reminders of what it meant to stand against overwhelming odds. Their stories were retold not to frighten children into obedience, but to inspire them to think for themselves, to question, and to remember that even the most ordinary person could leave behind an extraordinary mark. The monasteries that once kept secrets became guardians of history, preserving the truth rather than hiding it. Chroniclers, monks, and scholars copied the scrolls carefully, ensuring that the lessons would not be lost to fire, war, or time. And though rulers might still have preferred a simpler version of history, the people clung to the more complex and human story, because it felt closer to their own lives. What this left behind was not just a record of who had been most wanted, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human in a world full of fear and change. The conflicts, betrayals, and escapes were thrilling, but beneath them lay universal truths. The struggle for freedom, the price of power, the importance of loyalty, and the resilience of hope. These themes carried forward, long after the names themselves faded. In the end, the story found its peace not in capturing every outlaw or silencing every rebel, but in accepting that history is made by people, flawed, complicated, and deeply human. The audience, centuries later, could sit back and reflect on the strange way time works, how those who once terrified entire kingdoms could become sources of wisdom and inspiration. The medieval world may have been full of danger, but it was also full of lessons that echo into the present. And so the tale came to rest. The fugitives who had once stirred such fear became part of the quiet fabric of memory, their names written into history not just as criminals, but as catalysts. The kingdoms that once hunted them had risen and fallen. The castles had crumbled, but the stories remained. The suspense gave way to reflection, and what was left behind was not dread, but understanding. The most wanted people in medieval history had become something far more enduring than enemies of the crown. They had become reminders of the power of resilience, the danger of silencing voices, and the truth that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could shape the course of history. And as their stories were finally laid to rest, one thought lingered in the hearts of all who heard them. History is never just about the rulers. It is about those who dare to defy them. That is the true ending and the lasting legacy of the most wanted people in medieval history. Their chase is over, but their story lives on.